Every family has the dramatic child, right? But there's a new trend psychologists are calling main character syndrome, and it's taking a toll on our kids' ability to empathize.
We sometimes talk about that as like the cafeteria feeling of like when you're walking through the cafeteria holding your tray and feeling like all eyes are on you.
Social media is partly to blame, but there is something that you can do as a parent to make sure that your kid doesn't think they are the star of their own life.
We want to come at it from a place of kind of nudging them and presenting opportunities to consider that.
And do parents play favorites? New research says yes, and there's a scientific reason why. We explain. That's today on Mom Squad. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to Mom Squad, a show where we cover all the important parenting topics. I'm Maureen Kyle. If you've been watching for a while, you know that we've talked a lot about the impact that social media and smartphones are having on our kids. But there's a new phenomenon that some child psychologists are calling main character syndrome. Now, you may have heard it in a joking manner, talking about how someone needs a lot of attention or twists reality to make sure that the moment is all about them. But these tendencies are becoming more and more common in kids, and there are some concerns. So what are the signs of main character syndrome? If a child is exaggerating stories about their personal experiences, if they are intensely focused on appearance, if they post and narrate their life on social media, if they are having a hard time relating to or engaging in other people's emotions, and if they are distorting or dramatizing events to make them sound like they are the main character in their own life. Sometimes this behavior is harmless, but many times it's an indication of something deeper happening within the child's mental health. Today, we sit down with Dr. Tori Cordiano, who specializes in adolescent development.
So when you sent me this article, Maureen, the label was not something that I had yet come across. The description certainly is something that I've heard parents and professionals talk about and wondering about the impact of, especially with social media on our kids and how they express themselves.
I had to laugh at some of the description because I know some adults who are almost like this.
Right. Yeah, kids don't have a market on it, that's for sure.
Right. This is an epidemic, all thanks to probably social media and the smartphone. We'll get into that first. But if you can tell me, since you work so closely with especially adolescent girls, what is developmentally normal for some of these red flags, so-called, that we're seeing?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a helpful place to start. I'm glad you're starting there because we can pathologize things that are actually typical adolescent development. And one of the things that has always been true of adolescence is egocentrism. And this, it sounds like a bad trait. It's actually totally healthy, totally normal, especially for early adolescence, that kids tend to be pretty focused on their inner experience and then how they're being perceived by others. We sometimes talk about that as like the cafeteria feeling of like when you're walking through the cafeteria holding your tray and feeling like all eyes are on you. Adolescents often feel as if all eyes are on them, and that can be their internal experience. Again, that's not new, and it's not in itself problematic. It's just actually part of development.
So when we're talking about ages, what ages, at what point should they start to get out of that egocentrism?
Yeah. Well, we see, as kids move into more kind of middle adolescence, they tend to be a little less focused on just that inner experience. They can build up their own sense of self. One thing that really helps here is finding elements and avenues for purpose. So if they tap into things that are meaningful beyond themselves, and that could be babysitting work that they do, or volunteer work, or that they shovel their grandma's driveway, or they're involved in their religious organization, any of these things that tap into a sense of purpose does help to kind of counterbalance that all eyes on me feeling that is, uncomfortable for a lot of kids.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I didn't even think about that counterbalance that way. And I have age ranges in my own house. My kids are 11 down to 6. I would hope that my 6-year-old would have this service mind in some way or aspect. Like, is there any age that's too young to start to teach that purpose outside of themselves?
Nope, not at all. I mean, even with toddlers, we can talk about the ways that we help other people and how that's important for other people, and also how we feel good when we help other people. We model that. So, talking about it and modeling it are two very different but equally important things that we're actually showing our young children how we do that as a family. If this is important value for your family, we not only have it as an important value, but here's how we act on it, and we bring kids into it from a young age. What changes as they get older is that they can identify what feels important to them, where they want their time and their energy and their purposeful intentions to go.
When I was looking through this list of main character syndrome symptoms, I think the most concerning to me, just as a parent, there's a couple, but like the one that I was really concerned with is the empathy. And we're kind of talking about that with sense of purpose. But I would think that most parents want their child to have empathy for other people, for their friends, not being self-centered in terms of, when you're even just sitting at the cafeteria table, like listening to friends, being concerned about friends. What's the line? Like, where do you start to be concerned that empathy might be missing from their skill set? And then how do you foster that?
Yeah. So when we think about that empathy piece of things, and I think you're absolutely right, Maureen. I've yet to meet a parent in 2 decades of clinical work who has not wanted that for their child. Parents want their kids to be empathetic, and kids are empathetic. They express it in different ways. It runs sort of on a spectrum. Some kids are more empathetic than others, but kids are empathetic to the world around them, to the people they care about, to causes that are important to them. And if we're seeing that kids are never able to tap into that, or it's very hard for them to take another person's perspective or to consider how another person is feeling, we want to come at it from a place of kind of nudging them and presenting opportunities to consider that. If we're coming down from a place of blame or shame or criticism of you're not thinking about other people, you're selfish, you're focused only on yourself, nobody is going to respond well to that. So instead, we again sort of think about how do we counterbalance that inner focus and present opportunities, and then how do we shine a spotlight on even the small moments where they are. If you're helping set the table for dinner, or if you're helping a peer or a classmate, or you stand up for somebody, or even if you're saying, so-and-so seemed to have a bad day today and I felt bad for them, that you're leaning into that conversation and say, I'm sorry that happened for that friend, and tell me more about it. And, it's good that you noticed that, and just sort of providing that reflection for them.
Is there any other conversation that we should be having? I know in my own experience when there's been, I don't know, let's take a sibling fight for an example, because then I can keep it, just to my own family. I'm not calling out any friends or anything.
And we can all relate.
Right. And so, I keep saying, how do you think that made her feel? Like, how would you feel if somebody, took your diary and read it?
Yep.
Are those conversations what we should be having too, around maybe some squabbles?
Yes. Yeah. And I love that you brought it down to just regular family life, because these are, there's plenty of chances that we can build purpose and do volunteer work, but most of our time is spent with our family, with our classmates, and with our neighbors. And so that's where we're really thinking about these things. This is the real life where it happens. Having those conversations, I would say 2 things are helpful. First, it can be hard for kids to tap into that perspective taking in the heat of the moment. It's a little bit like trying to talk at a tornado. So if we're able to take it back and then maybe revisit it later on, I know that got heated. I can tell you were upset. I wonder how your sister felt when she found out that you read her diary, right? That you're just sort of putting it out there. The second is that we can go pretty far in our questions and our conversation if we're coming from a warm, loving, trusting, curious place. There is a big difference between how do you think that made her feel? And I wonder how she felt when that happened. Those are essentially the same question, but you're going to get a very different response based on how it's phrased.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I talked to Dr. Cordiano about extracurricular activities that your child might want to join if you need them to learn a little empathy. But before we go, how do you get teens to disconnect from social media? According to a psychiatrist from Michigan State University, you need to set the example. Teens are more likely to disconnect when parents do too. The research also suggests ways to connect with them in person. Welcome back. There's a buzz phrase that you've probably heard, main character syndrome. It's not a clinical diagnosis, but it does refer to behavior in which a person acts as if they are the central focus in every situation and everyone else is just a supporting character. Some people would laugh and say it's cute, but psychologists are discovering that it can lead to a lack of empathy in developing minds. It also leads to self-centered behavior and attention seeking. Today, we are talking with Dr. Tori Cordiano, a clinical psychologist who specializes in adolescent behavior. Just before the break, we were discussing how to foster empathy in your children. Taking it back to the spotlight, and now I am going to maybe call out a friend. I don't know if she watches or not, but she was concerned about her child's empathy skills. And she was talking to a counselor and they said, why don't you put your child in acting lessons? Because then that can teach them how to put themselves in other people's shoes. What do you think of that kind of activity or task for a child?
Yeah, it's such a brilliant suggestion. And there's actually research looking at things like performing arts and actually reading fiction as elements and ways and avenues for kids to build their empathy. So anything like that, if you have a kid who has a flair for the dramatic and they're interested in that, getting them in some sort of performing arts, especially something like acting where they're taking on a different role. I love that idea. Improv is a great way to kind of manage that or tap into that. And then if you have a kid who's maybe not as interested as performing on a stage, guiding them toward character-driven fiction where they can really sort of think about different people's perspectives is another avenue.
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up too is as we're talking about main character syndrome and kids loving the spotlight. Right. Like, that's where I'm sorry, I had to call out my friend's situation here because to me, I was thinking, well, wait, if somebody is having problems with main character syndrome, do we want to thrust them into a spotlight, like go into an acting class where you end up getting the lead part and you're the main character?
Yeah. I would say actually it's a really healthy way to channel that energy. So if you are part of a perspective, unless it's a one man or a one woman show, right, you're going to be acting with other people. You're not free to just like take over the production and have all eyes on you all the time, even if you do land the main role. And everybody in there is collaborating and working together toward a common goal. So again, if we tap into that idea of purpose, that's a very purposeful activity, but it can also draw on a child's desire to have a little bit more focus on them or have a little bit more attention on them.
Mm-hmm. And now we've talked about the solution a lot. I want to go and delve a little bit more into when it's concerning. Sure. Just because you and I have talked about the impact smartphones have had, social media has had on adolescents, but when is it a little bit more than a flair for the dramatic, and we're starting to see some of those mental health tolls?
Yeah. And so I think, it's important to first say that this main character syndrome, it is not a clinical diagnosis. It is not a disorder. It's not going to be found in any, DSM or anything like that, right? So when we're talking about it, it's like a descriptive label to capture these behaviors. For most people, it's not going to go beyond something that we have to have some conversations about or maybe kind of balance out with some other activities or occasionally find sort of irksome. For some kids, it may trend into this territory of we're spending way too much time engaged in these activities. And it often is going to pair with device use. So it may be a place where we just have to set some firmer limits and expectations on when, where, and how we are using those devices, and really being sure to provide oversight and check-ins about how it's going with technology use, especially with younger kids, their prefrontal cortex, that part of their brain that's involved in good decision making. It's undercooked. It's not fully developed yet, and it won't be until their mid-20s. So most kids, all kids, need guardrails around how they're using their devices, and some kids need a little bit more oversight in using them in healthy ways. Mm-hmm.
One of the other kind of red flags that I saw in the description of, when kids are kind of having, and like you said, it's not a clinical diagnosis, but, just sort of some behavior. The twisting of stories and storylines and the little lies, that tend to make it a little bit more dramatic, tend to make the focus turn back on somebody. When kids start altering reality, altering the truth, How do you handle that as a parent or maybe teacher or somebody, grandparent even?
Yeah. I think there's a couple different ways. There's not one way to get this right. What we do want to avoid is stepping into a power struggle with kids of, tell me the truth, or I know you're lying, or, that sort of thing, because again, it brings shame. Nobody responds well to that. So I think in a separate moment, you can have a conversation with your child around, I heard the way that you were talking about so-and-so, and it just raised some red flags for me because I know you're a really kind kid. I know you care about your classmates. And, some of the things that you were saying, I'm not sure how they would feel if they heard that. I'm not sure how accurate those things are. So you're really giving the benefit of the doubt, and you're hoping to engage them in a conversation that involves some reflection. If it, in lying, not telling the truth is something that comes up pretty often in early adolescence and in childhood. And sometimes it's as simple as like, you and I both know that's not true. You and I both know that so-and-so isn't doing whatever, that you can just sort of acknowledge it and move on and help to kind of set the train on the track again.
Is this a slippery slope into other issues like anxiety and depression, like we've seen with social media use and smartphone use?
Yeah. There's no evidence saying that this particular behavior is going to lead to any of these mental health challenges or diagnoses. Again, what we do know is spending way too much time or big chunks of your day on social media, tied into your device at the expense of other activities that we know boost physical and mental health, that's where we get into tricky territory. So if you're noticing that these behaviors are eclipsing other things that your child used to enjoy doing or should be doing, that's when we start to get concerned and we need to check in. Sometimes we need to get some help from a professional, and sometimes we just need to have some conversations about setting healthier boundaries around how we're using the phone.
And I think I also want to bring up too, because I think a conversation that keeps coming up among my peer groups when we're talking about smartphones, there tends to be like, okay, if you've already let Pandora's box open and your child has a social media account too young, or we've already let them have this phone, but now I'm seeing these concerning behaviors. What's a healthy way to, you can't shut Pandora's box again, but like how do you start to scale back in a healthy way where a child will use it as a teaching moment as well?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought this up. I hear from so many parents who find themselves in this situation. Of course, it's great to start with more boundaries, more limits, and then go from there. That's not always the case. Sometimes we find like, oops, we let them take this too far. And then it's time for one of kids' favorite things to hear, which is, we made a mistake. I, as your mom, I, as your dad, we goofed, right? We didn't really think this through. This isn't about you. This isn't about our trust in you. This is about us not really thinking through what it would mean if you had Snapchat, or what it would mean if we let you keep your phone in your room overnight, right? Like, it's on us, and sometimes we have to course correct, and this is us doing that. And it may not feel fair, but sometimes that has to happen. So if we're able to actually acknowledge our own sort of like, yeah, we kind of goofed here, and now we're going to have to figure it out. And it's okay if you're annoyed or upset with us about that. Our job is to keep you safe, and this is our best knowledge of how to do it.
I love it. Tori, this has been so great. Anything else with main character syndrome that you think parents really need to know?
Yeah. I think the only other thing that comes to mind, Maureen, is we can see these articles, and sometimes it can cause alarm or a lot of worry about our kids at this age. And it's helpful to address behaviors when we see them, but it's also helpful to recognize when we zoom out all the incredible things about this age range. Kids at this age are passionate, they're connected, they care deeply about the things that they're interested in. And if we're able to sort of notice those things as well, it can alleviate some parent anxiety too.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I do feel like since I'm starting to get into that age range, I'm just anxious all the time about, are we doing the right thing? Is she, I'm looking at all the bad things and forgetting about some of the amazing development that my child is going through. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for asking me to join you. It's always fun to talk.
Tori, thank you again. You can check out Dr. Tori Cordiano on her website, drtoricordiano.com. She has virtual courses for parents and caregivers. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, red dye number 3 is set to be banned in foods. What doctors think this will do for your kids. Welcome back. Let's get caught up on some big news affecting your kids. Recently, the Food and Drug Administration said they will ban the use of red dye number 3 in foods because of its link to cancer in animals. Our Anaya Falcon talked to some doctors who think this is a step in the right direction.
Fear of certain dyes in food has many people double-checking nutrition facts at the grocery store, trying to avoid items made with red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, and blue dye number 1.
The dyes are very scary when you consider the fact that in Europe they're not used at all. Why are they allowed in the United States?
A question hundreds of people wanted an answer to as they protested at the Kellogg headquarters in Michigan late last year. The protesters were calling for the cereal giant to make good on their promise of removing artificial dyes from their cereals sold in the U.S. A York County mom of 3 says it worries her knowing there are unsafe ingredients in her kids' food.
With my kids when they were really young, I didn't buy things with artificial coloring in them. As they've gotten older, it's gotten more difficult because certainly school and friends and going other places, they're introduced to more and different foods.
And one Harrisburg mom and daycare provider says she feels defenseless when choosing items to put into her cart.
They market it so well, like with the characters and stuff on the boxes, but then it's really not good. They need to be more transparent about the damages that it causes with the kids, because it's like the leading cause of like ADHD and autism, and I'm seeing it as a provider, I'm seeing it more in the kids.
A national board-certified health and wellness coach says the artificial food dyes also have a slew of other health effects, like nerve, immune system, energy, and cancer-causing effects.
The first thing that I would tell parents is to read the food label and to look for dyes, look for preservatives like BHT, look for the sugar content. So then from there, cut out the breakfast cereals.
Peterson says if a product does not contain dyes, watch out for bioengineered ingredients.
It's cheaper to use dyes and it's more shelf stable. So the companies in the US can gain more profits. So in other countries, the consumers seem to be a little bit more aware.
The FDA plans to ban red dye 3 in the U.S. for all products by 2028. And here in Pennsylvania, there are 2 bills that have been stuck in the House since last March, targeting toxic chemicals and food. But Peterson says parents have the power in their hands.
When we feed them the right foods, they're going to have the energy, the strength to be able to perform and be their best, as well as in their later years, perform well at their job, to be able to have emotional regulation, to be able to live their best life without the pains of cancer and obesity and diabetes.
Older children are affected by long COVID differently than their younger siblings. A new study by the National Institute of Health found school-aged kids were more likely to suffer low energy and exhaustion. But young children and toddlers were more likely to experience prolonged headaches. This study followed nearly 4,000 kids since March of 2022. They found school-aged kids were also more likely to report trouble focusing and body aches with long COVID symptoms. Well, if you always suspected your parents had a favorite child, it isn't a myth. A recent study published in the American Psychological Association says parents are more inclined to favor daughters or children who are agreeable and conscientious. The researchers looked at nearly 20,000 kids of all ages, birth order, and personality traits. It was the more organized and responsible kids who were given favoritism with interactions and resources, meaning spending. And the siblings who received less favored treatment tended to have poorer mental health and strained family relationships. That sounds like a future Mom Squad episode to me. Thank you for joining me on this week's Mom Squad. Remember, you can watch all of the episodes you missed on your local news streaming app and catch up on the Mom Squad YouTube page. I'm Maureen Kyle. We'll see you back here next week.